Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
I'm Nathan Kiker. Welcome to our podcast, Clearer Than Truth. I'm glad to be joined by my co-host, George Bogdan.
The wisdom of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson inspires our episodes. We emphasize clarity while examining the intricate global issues of today for a diverse audience.
In a world where time is limited, we distill complex ideas, making them not just comprehensible, but in Acheson's words, clearer than truth. Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker, and I am joined by my co-host, George Bogdan. Our guest today is James Barnett. James is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he studies conflict, terrorism, and geopolitics in Africa. He joined us earlier this year. Before we dive into our interview with James, let's take a look at the news of the day. President Biden is preparing for a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping at the upcoming APEC summit, aiming to address trade, climate, and geopolitical tensions. In Gaza, the ceasefire remains fragile as Israel and Hamas continue negotiations for hostages and aid amid ongoing regional tensions. President-elect Donald Trump is continuing to prepare his administration. His initial appointments signal a focus on loyalists and experienced allies from his first administration. With that, let's dive into our interview with James Barnett. James, thanks for joining us today.
Nathan, George, thanks for having me on.
So glad to have you back and chatting about what we hope will be a really interesting subject for our listeners, which is your specialization regionally in Africa, but also about kind of dynamics across the continent in general. And I guess in that spirit, I'd love to hear what you think is kind of the general perception of folks in Nigeria, but perhaps in the broader region of that part of Africa about his ascendance and any other kind of observations you have.
Yeah, thanks very much, George. I think, I don't even think you said his name, but it's almost like, I don't think if that's a Voldemort thing. I think it's just, it goes unsaid that we're talking about Trump here.
Right.
But no, it's fine. I know that was the context. It's news everywhere, right? I think that there certainly wasn't much surprise here in Nigeria. I'd say probably even, even in the U.S., right? If you talk about people who are strongly anti-Trump, I think that there's a bit more of a resignation in terms of even kind of American liberal and leftist attitudes, or even the never Trump attitudes towards the second Trump admin than there was in 2016. Which I remember. I was also in Africa in 2016 on the other side of the continent in Tanzania. And woke up to that news and was very surprised. And, this really kind of changed my, I just graduated from college, and very much changed my understanding of even, what is American politics or stuff. And then, 8 years later or whatever it is, and how many of those years I've spent actually living on this continent, and I wake up to the news, I'm like, so, that sounds not surprising. I think, but many Nigerians, many of my Nigerian friends and colleagues assumed that he was going to win. People follow American politics pretty closely. In our politics are pretty kind of our system, and everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly is all pretty open out there on international media, social media, all that stuff. And Nigerians are keen observers of American politics. There's obviously a huge Nigerian diaspora in the country. So, all to say that, I haven't spoken to anyone who was actually very surprised about Trump's election. In terms of kind of what do people think, what does it mean? I guess that there are kind of two ways to look at it, right? One is, in terms of the conversations I've had, say, in the past, however long it's been, 2 weeks, the two types of conversations. One looks at, okay, what does this mean for Africa? And there's a bit of, a kind of trying to forecast or speculate a bit about based on what the Trump admin did the first time around, what does this mean for the continent, for American foreign policy, not just in Africa, but the broader world. People talk a lot about, of course, the war in Gaza and Middle East, and talk about Ukraine and stuff. But I've also, maybe this is a topic for a different discussion. But I've found that a lot of my friends and colleagues here have, are also very interested in, to discuss what it means about America, right? And I think people have had pretty interesting insights. Like I said, people follow our politics pretty closely. I think it's pretty open to the world. And so I've had some, I think, interesting discussions, from friends and colleagues here say, yeah, this is what it says about attitudes towards immigration, globalization, all of that. So like I said, there's definitely keen interest in kind of the American political angle. But in terms of what it means for U.S. foreign policy, I think that, I mean, like I said, I'm not aware of any serious kind of consternation, if you will, in certainly not in Nigeria, which I think, if anything, the Nigerian political elites are maybe thinking that they might kind of Trump might be a bit easier to deal with than Biden, because one of the few kind of differences on Africa policy, and I'm precedent or preface all of this by saying that Africa, it was not a strategic priority under Biden, despite the fact that he said it would be, nor was it under Obama, nor was it under Trump in the first administration. I think we do need to recognize that. The U.S. foreign policy does not typically kind of put a ton of the foreign policy establishment has not put a ton of kind of energy and resources into, crafting, say, a grand strategy for Africa, to the extent, the Biden administration released an Africa strategy, but a lot of it was kind of quite, aspirational and just talking about really more like, kind of, this is nice things that we say we support in the region, but there wasn't actually really kind of a full strategy behind that, right? Ways, means, and ends. So I don't think that, that's going to really change too much under Trump, except that maybe there is this kind of understanding or this view, I think not just here in Nigeria, but across much of the continent, that, a second Trump administration will be, depending on whether you're pro or anti-Trump, either pragmatic or transactional, right? That's how people talk about it. And I think in the context of, say, maybe, the NATO alliance or stuff like that, when you use this term transactional, it sounds, it clearly kind of has a bit of a negative connotation, right? Because we're talking about an alliance that's supposed to be built on shared values, as well as just, kind of mutual interests. I think in Africa, African, not just the politicians, but the elites, the intellectuals and stuff, they're pretty clear eyed about the limits of kind of what a values based foreign policy, U.S. kind of values based foreign policy in Africa means, because we've never really lived up to that rhetoric, and so I think there's a view that a lot of times, kind of U.S. foreign policy in Africa can be a bit inconsistent or hypocritical, because on the one hand, there's often a lot of preaching about human rights and stuff, and the need for kind of, kind of the spread democracy, and you have that kind of elements of U.S. Africa policy. But then you have, a lot of U.S. Africa policy is based around kind of, narrow security interests, like trying to contain, the jihadist violence. These are groups like, Al Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates, the ones that, are a threat to the U.S. or the West broadly, trying to contain migration and immigration, and then very clearly, despite the fact that the Biden administration tried to kind of couch this in different language, but a lot of the investment in Africa, or a lot of the kind of initiatives now, are aimed at kind of curtailing or competing with Chinese investments, particularly, and then also Russian kind of operations and influence in Africa. So I think that all to say, African political elites and leaders and stuff, they already kind of see U.S. foreign policy as like, they don't see it necessarily as altruistic or anything. They understand that this is kind of a transactional thing, but then there's also this kind of inconsistent layer where we come in and it's like, okay, we're clearly trying to compete with China. We'll work with one regime that's maybe not too democratic, but then when they do certain things, under the Biden administration, it was certain countries that passed these very harsh kind of anti-LGBT laws and stuff. That's then where the government kind of comes out and condemns them and stuff. And so when people say the Trump administration is going to be more transactional in Africa, I think that, that is seen as, okay, maybe in some ways it's a bit more predictable, right? That, you don't have to worry about certain kind of human rights, kind of a strong emphasis on, say, certain types of issues like the LGBT stuff, or treatment of minorities, so long as you're kind of willing to play ball on some of the other things, like accepting investment from, American corporations and, kind of the DFC and that kind of stuff. And then, participating or cooperating on the basic kind of shared security interests. I think it is, there's the reality is a bit more complicated, and you need to look kind of country by country. Like, for example, in the case of Nigeria, typically under Republican administrations, you have a bit more scrutiny of kind of these religious liberty, religious freedom issues in Nigeria, right? Which is a country that's roughly 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. A lot of the violence in Nigeria, I should say, you know, actually, as I kind of show in a lot of my research, or as I kind of argue and have um, written about quite extensively. I think much of the violence in Nigeria is not fundamentally religious in nature. It's, about various other issues. And actually, a lot of the violence happens within, say, Christian communities or Muslim communities. But under a Trump administration, for example, the previous one, there was, more kind of scrutiny on what was then a northern Muslim president's administration, and how the killings of Christians in places like the central regions of Nigeria. So it is, I think that there could be each administration, each kind of political party, right, has its own. Uh, I don't know what to call them exactly, kind of areas that they kind of emphasize a bit more when they're in power, right? Maybe it's religious freedom. When it's Republicans, it's LGBT stuff. When it's Democrats, so under no side, neither side gives like a purely transactional relationship or a purely pragmatic approach to the continent. But by and large, I think there is a sense that maybe Trump's will be a bit more predictable in some ways. So.
Yeah, that really resonates with me because, when I was in the Balkans, that was during Trump's, initial rise. And there was a real literacy among folks there about his kind of politics. And they just said over and over again, this is a really powerful thing and it has nothing to do with our cultural context, And I was just sort of amazed at their ability to kind of interpret American politics with such clarity. Fascinating answer. Thanks.
Do you have any reason to think that the Trump administration will actually prioritize African policy this time?
I mean, it depends what you mean by kind of prioritize, right? Like I guess in some ways it's kind of a low bar you're starting from. I do think that one kind of tension that existed in the Biden administration was this, the need to kind of couch things rhetorically. And I'm not being, purely cynical here. I kind of understand why they're doing it and to some extent sympathize with it. But this, the need to kind of couch things rhetorically as, we care about Africa for its own sake, and we see these countries as important long-term partners and stuff, but then kind of coupled with the underlying reality of, the fundamental policy towards Africa is still to kind of see, not to see Africa as having much intrinsic strategic value. It's an arena where the so-called great power competition is playing out, or where you need to, engage in counterterrorism, a degree of, security assistance, the counterterrorism front, or what have you. And so there was, I think, this kind of tension where, on the one hand, the American diplomats are trying very hard to say, oh, no, things are changing. We really care about Africa now. We care about it for our own right. We're not telling you to pick sides in this, competition with China or Russia or whatever. But then also, but clearly we have some concerns about what Russia's doing. Clearly we don't like it when you do this stuff with China, but we want to avoid, coming across as too aggressive in saying that. But then sometimes they kind of spill over and they just come across as very patronizing and stuff. I think that the Trump administration's just kind of wholehearted embrace of this more, well, we're competing with China. And these are the basic security interests, and this is, foreign policy is more about securing the core interests of the United States and our partners, and let's talk business as well, commercial stuff like that. I think in some ways you might actually get rhetoric that kind of, by being perhaps a bit blunter, and by framing Africa in terms of these issues that kind of really are the top priorities, for the U.S. Government, in U.S. foreign policy right now. I think to some extent that is, if that makes sense, there's a bit of it might actually bring Africa, more into the broader foreign policy discourse to some extent. But I don't expect a fundamental change. I think that what I'm describing here is kind of a bit marginal, and or a bit and superficial as well. I mean, the Trump administration did some, made some kind of new initiatives, particularly the Development Finance Corporation in the first term. So this kind of, I think, a focus or a shift away from, purely kind of foreign aid that's allotted through Congress to the State Department and the USAID for kind of these development assistance programs, humanitarian assistance, towards a focus on we need to increase the amount of kind of American private sector investment in Africa. So we'll probably see a bit more continuation of that. A lot of it will depend on whether it's some of the same people from the first Trump admin, the second Trump admin. I'm no longer a DC insider. I'm based on the other side of the world, so you guys probably know as much as I do on that front. But
no one is a DC insider. Everyone thinks they are, but no one is.
Yeah, exactly. The first thing to do is to know your own limits and admit
That's
them.
right.
But I think that it's possible that the Trump admin will, on some issues, like for example, on the Sudanese civil war, that they'll be willing to kind of take sides in these kind of very messy conflicts. And I don't mean take sides as in like boots on the ground or anything like that, but U.S. foreign policy, and there was a bit of this under Trump, I would say, under the Ethiopian civil war to some extent. But the Biden administration has kind of, because Africa has not really been a priority, Sudan is kind of the clearest case of this, but we also saw some of this, I think, lack of strategy and coordination at points in West Africa over the past few years, where there's been a series of recent coups. This kind of idea just not to, okay, our policy is essentially to, condemn the violence and call for de-escalation, which doesn't really actually change anything on the ground. I think that, there are some kind of pragmatists in the Trump foreign policy orbit who will see some of the things that are happening in Africa, like the Sudanese civil war, through the lens of that great power competition, and even what's happening in the Middle East in terms of, the very kind of the difference. You have like the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, even the Iranians. They're all engaged in the Horn of Africa, and specifically in that civil war. In West Africa, you have this concern about the Wagner Group, the Russian mercenaries there. So I do think maybe the Trump administration will be a bit less equivocal and more kind of quicker to just say, okay, yep, this is the side we support, right? This is the side we're backing. So almost a bit more like the Cold War dynamics, and less of a concern about, okay, but this side we're backing, these are some nasty people or some nasty governments, they don't have a perfect human rights record or what have you. So in that sense, I think that there could be, again, it's not that Africa will become more of a priority, but by kind of explicitly framing it in the context of this, the geopolitical priorities and great power competition and all that stuff, and dropping some of the pretense of kind of liberal internationalism, if you will, I think that will maybe lead to some decisions on the ground that do, they do kind of suggest more of a strategy than just kind of rhetoric and wishful thinking and some, humanitarian assistance, development assistance, some of which is very important, but often, falls very short of really moving the needle in terms of changing things. Now, whether that will actually, whether this is a good or bad thing will, I think, vary and depend on a case by case basis. And there are some, parts of Africa, some countries, governments, I think are set to probably benefit a lot more from a Trump admin than others. So I'm sorry, I can't give you exactly a clear answer, but maybe the clear answer is no, it won't be more of a priority. But also, there might be a bit more of what looks like a strategy, at least in certain regions.
Well, did President Biden have a strategy in Africa?
Well, on paper, as did Trump. And then I think, it's the problem that U.S. foreign policy has kind of, or that successive U.S. administrations since the end of the Cold War have faced, is kind of just, they don't really, and it's, it's very much a problem of their own making, I guess I would say, but they don't kind of have the same focus on Africa and resourcing, and even kind of the sense of, what are the key things? What are the key things that they need to uphold, right? In terms of like, what are the main strategic objectives? So if we look at Europe, it's like, okay, preserving NATO and a prosperous EU and stuff like that's just no brainer, right? And, obviously, because of this whole question about the sharing defense burdens and stuff, maybe, under Trump, the rhetoric and the perspective changed. I will speculate what it'll look like in the second term. But generally speaking, there's been a pretty consistent foreign policy towards there. In the Middle East, right? Whatever your view is on this, but it's like support for Israel, right? I mean, there's not been a president who's been like, no, we're fully throwing our weight behind, the Palestinian administration that will come out and like fight Israel or anything, right? So you've had these kind of consistent planks or pillars in foreign policy. You've not really had that in Africa under then kind of, try to maintain the status quo to make sure things don't get any worse, but also not put enough skin and resources in the game to actually influence what's happening in a lot of these countries, to say prevent a country like Sudan from falling apart or Ethiopia. And then there are also these other nice things we'd like, such as, we want more governance and, all the liberal international stuff, more women in parliaments, LGBT kind of protections and stuff like that. Oh yeah, and we want more trade, we want opportunities for US businesses. But, that stuff doesn't really make its way up to like the top 5 or 10 lists of, the agenda items for the National Security Council principals meeting, right? Most days. That stuff is kind of, there's a cadre of people, State Department, the Defense Department, all these regions who work on Africa. Some of them are very talented. Some of them, do things strategically, but it's not necessarily, those things aren't really getting teed up to the principals, right? For the kind of big decisions. So I would say under both Trump and Biden, there wasn't really kind of a major, a strategy per se. I mean, John Bolton told my friend who's an economist correspondent and has written this a few times when he was interviewing his book, John Bolton claims that I don't think Trump ever read the Africa strategy he wrote for him. And then I think you hear kind of similar gripes from the Biden administration. You have this some very talented people wrote this very, interesting national security strategy for Africa that that kind of listed all these great things that U.S. policy would try to achieve. And then, but if you actually look at the past 2 years, what was the Biden administration's record in Africa? Well, it's like, the outbreak of the Sudanese civil war in April 2023, which the U.S., seemed caught off guard by and hasn't been able to influence that, the trajectory of that conflict. It had all since then. And then in July of last year as well, July of 2023, the coup in Niger followed up, which followed coups in Burkina Faso and Mali. But the one in Niger was really the bitter pill to swallow because that's where the U.S. had put a lot of its military forces, invested a lot in that, the government of Mohammed Bazoum, and then was eventually kicked out of there. So you have two pretty serious, glaring, what look like strategic failures, despite this, kind of large, articulate and nice sounding strategy for Africa. But when you look at it, see a lot of failure.
What do you think some of his successes were in Africa? Like, what would be the defining successes that will still have an impact in 10 to 15 years, if any?
I mean, I think the last continent on which in which George W. Bush was like significantly popular, say in 2008 when he had pretty low historic ratings everywhere else, that was in Africa. PEPFAR, has saved millions of lives. I mean, and that it's almost because it's like a less political, it's not really a political hot potato, though. Actually, there are some Republican lawmakers who I think really want to end that assistance or dramatically reduce it because of some, the Mexico City policy and linkages to that. But PEPFAR, I mean, that one's a no-brainer, right? That one saved a ton of lives. There have been like there were successes, certainly kind of later in the Cold War and then even in the immediate period after. And so if you look at like kind of the Mono River countries, I mean, again, I don't want to. It's like without giving too much credit to the U.S., right? Because it's the U.S. has not like come in and like fixed or saved any of these countries, right? I want to avoid that kind of very ambitious, whatever you want to call it, the kind of liberal interventionism or white saviorism, or we need to be pretty humble in what's been achieved. But you do look at countries like Liberia that, is horrible. And I mean, they're still facing significant challenges, but you look at everything from, some of the kind of efforts that were done in terms of security sector reform and reconstruction after the war to kind of build up, rebuild the semblance of a state to, even what happened with Ebola in 2014 with, some of the response that was there and the assistance delivered. Um, so, there is, I mean, and I'm sure it could go on, right? I have that problem of the negative bias because I mostly study, I study conflict and security, right? So I mostly study the regions where things aren't going well. Even here in Nigeria, I always have to reassure my Nigerian colleagues, like, I'm studying the worst parts of your country. I know that there's the reality is not all, um, it's not all warlordism and terrorism by any means. But yeah, that's kind of what I focus on. So
We've sort of gotten a broad overview of the continent, but what are the specific conflicts you're covering now that our listeners should know about? I know when you were on before, we discussed Sudan, but there's a lot of conflicts popping up. Where are they now? Where are they going?
yeah, I mean, I think in terms of to the extent that the U.S. is kind of, I'd say, prioritizing, or sees certain areas as kind of, crises of more, strategic or broader significance. Definitely. So the war in Sudan that's been raging for unfortunately over a year. But more broadly speaking, though, the Horn of Africa as a whole is also in a somewhat tense position right now in terms of the kind of relations between the various states. It's something of an evergreen statement to say, oh, their tensions are high in the Horn of Africa for the past 30 years or 60 years or however long you want to look at it. There's often been a strong degree of geopolitical rivalry and tension there. But since, you had the horrific Ethiopian civil war from 2020 to 2022, that then kind of, I think, even to the surprise of many outside observers, ended somewhat quickly, or I should say somewhat decisively, essentially a military victory and then a ceasefire. Ethiopia is still having, internal insurgencies and stuff, but the country is more or less moving ahead. But then, since January when it kind of embarked on this controversial, it had been trying for over a year, been talking about, the Ethiopian government had been talking about securing access to the Red Sea, which it lost when Eritrea gained independence in the 90s. And so, that kind of started this broader tension about Ethiopian expansion, all that stuff. Eventually, they secured a memorandum of understanding with Somaliland to try to get this, lease a strip of coastline in Somaliland to build a port and naval base in exchange for recognizing the de facto but yet unrecognized state. So that's led to a lot of tensions with the Horn of Africa, I'm happy to talk about, but within Somalia, within the broader region. So you have Sudan and the broader Horn. That's obviously quite significant. In West Africa, you have this kind of gradual but serious problem of kind of the expansion of these jihadist insurgencies that 10 years ago were kind of really kicking off in Mali and then eventually spread into neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger, and now and these are the three countries that are now under military juntas that have kicked out Western military trainers, embraced the Russians instead. So there's that geopolitical angle. But then, just purely from the conflict dynamics, which is much more what I study, the expansion of jihadist groups into kind of coastal West Africa, which, the U.S. and the Europeans and stuff for the past few years have really been kind of focusing on, okay, well, the conflict is already quite intense in the landlocked Sahelian countries, that kind of draw relative of, the middle of West Africa, if you will. But the fear is this conflict is moving into the more populous coastal West African countries, the ones that are very, connected economically with the global marketplace and stuff. This is where the ports are. This is where the mega cities in West Africa are. And so a fear that jihadist violence is going to kind of disrupt that economic, kind of political, area of real strategic significance. So that is actually an issue that I study a good bit through my work in Nigeria, because I look at kind of the linkages between, this conflict that's been raging in the northeast of Nigeria for a while. It's a bit quieter now, but still, quite violent, which is the Boko Haram conflict. You now have different jihadist factions there, but broadly speaking, we can call it the Boko-Haram conflict. And then that in the northwest of the country, on the other side of the country, you have these real issues with kind of this criminal violence, intercommunal violence, and warlordism, what I call bandit efforts. And this is an issue that might seem niche to some people in DC, but these beyond the fact that from kind of a conflict analysis or conflict studies perspective, this is a very understudied and I think still poorly understood conflict. It's also one that is providing kind of a gateway for jihadist expansion in some ways, because you have these jihadists from either like say Sahel, places like Mali, coming into Nigeria, taking advantage of the existing instability and violence to kind of set up camp, or you have the Boko Haram guys from the northeast moving to the other side of the country, kind of doing the same thing. So that's an area that I work on a lot. I do a bit of work in Somalia still, kind of doing analysis and consulting the conflict dynamics. But most of my research looks at Nigeria and the different forms of insecurity that you have across the country. I mean, I could go on at length about this, but just to briefly kind of encapsulate, right? Nigeria is a very big, diverse country. It's more than 200 million people, the most populous in Africa. And so you have a ton of diversity in terms of the culture, the society, religion, politics, even the economic, the kind of microeconomic dimensions or dynamics in each part of the country can be somewhat different, because you have some areas that are heavily that's where they produce the oil and the natural resources. Other areas where they don't really have that. And then also what you see is that the actual criminal, like the violence, whether it's militancy or criminal violence, and the lines are often blurred, that you have these kind of common causes of violence, if you will, across the country, but they take on these local, they manifest themselves in these local forms that are very closely tied to local history, politics, and society. So a lot of my research is actually going around the 6 different subnational regions of Nigeria, trying to understand what those local security dynamics are. And I'm working on a PhD to that effect that hopefully one day will be a book. But yeah, that's I could talk your ear off for many ages about conflict in Nigeria, but to the extent it connects with those broader issues, a lot of it is looking at that question of the broader jihadist expansion in West Africa.
Do you think, given kind of recent appointments we've seen heading towards the Trump administration, our incoming HHS Secretary RFK Jr. Has a particular view on AIDS' origin, and to the extent that PEPFAR was a sort of visionary program that made President Bush famous across the continent. I mean, if we see a kind of contraction of aid in that regard, is that going to severely impact the United States, or is that kind of missing the picture? I've always thought that's rather simplistic, that African leaders have a great deal of agency in terms of thinking about what's going to be the future of their continent and their particular governments in terms of relations with the West. How does that square?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Maybe I should begin by caveating that I'm not a public health specialist. On the contrary, I mean, I seem to just always have a baseline level of malaria, because I refuse to take malaria meds, not out of any RFK Jr. type of beliefs, but just because they give me horrible side effects. So I'm not the one to go for public health advice or insights. But on the political angle, maybe, which is what I can talk about, I think the kind of, on the one hand, what I would say is that the very good and important public health assistance and stuff that the U.S. government provides to has provided to the region for the past 30 years or so, it's I think intrinsically good because it's saved a ton of lives. It's also not, and to the extent that the U.S. has some strong soft power in Africa, it's part of it, but it's not. The PEPFAR and stuff was never what was kind of. It was never making the U.S. this kind of undisputed, like, oh, force for good in Africa, right? Because there's all the other stuff that's going on, right? And especially as that program goes on, and as the HIV crisis is less acute than it was 20, 30 years ago, it's not something that, like, people don't stop you in the street and say, oh, you're an American, I want to thank your president for this, right? They think about other contemporary stuff. They have opinions on the American government's support for this government in Africa, or the war in Gaza. or the war in Ukraine, right? So there's this, in terms of kind of public perceptions of the United States, it's much more complex and driven by much more than just public health. So fundamentally, kind of again, I don't want to speculate what's going to happen with the Trump administration in that regard. I don't think that it's, changing kind of how stuff is funded or even the extent of funding in that area is maybe not going to have a direct and immediate kind of effect in terms of the U.S. standing in the region. But it does, it does matter. And I think that, beyond, again, the kind of intrinsic value of this stuff, when it becomes, like to take COVID, for example, right? There was initially, I think, they're kind of looking at this whole question of like the vaccine nationalism and when vaccines were given out and stuff. There's almost like there's the political dimension and then the public health, or maybe even want to call it the social dimension to it. And I saw this because I moved to Nigeria, when the COVID pandemic was still happening in the U.S. after they lifted their travel ban and stuff, or the border closures. And on the one hand, the vaccine nationalism, this what they call it, right? The hoarding of vaccines, or the lack of equitable distribution of vaccines from global north countries to global south countries. It was something that was, I think that a lot of African governments, and certainly those in the public health space, were really angry about. And I think it did kind of, it reminded people and even to the extent it was discussed in media, it reminded people of kind of like the second hand, the secondary status or standing that African countries have in the international system, right? So it was like this glaring reminder that, like, oh yeah, the rich countries, up there in Europe and the US, they don't think you guys are as important. So people kind of, it mattered in that sense. It had political implications. What I also saw, and it might have been very different. I think in other countries like Kenya, Uganda, there was much more of a strong kind of push for actual vaccination. But in Nigeria, people moved on from COVID very quickly because, for a variety of reasons, it was not as severe in Africa as a lot of Western, commentators and medical professionals, epidemiologists had initially expected. So it's not like, because I bring this up because I remember at the time there was a real debate, and lots of people were very emphatic that, this is going to have a serious impact on U.S. and Western standing in Africa if we're not getting, if the Chinese get more vaccines, instead of the Americans, this is going to have geopolitical ramifications. And, that was only 3-4 years ago. It's completely in the past, right? No one talks about COVID anymore. Sorry, that's my wife's phone. She left it on the table. I think that's her auntie calling. Yeah, so I mean, it's, I guess what it's important to recognize there are political dimensions to the kind of public health diplomacy, or if you want to call it that. But my general approach and take on this is more, I mean, for lack of a better word, just I don't know, humanistic, right? Like, if we can do something to have a positive impact here, we should, because, the amount that we spend on foreign assistance, including foreign health assistance and humanitarian aid, is a drop in the bucket of total federal spending. We're the biggest, richest, most powerful country on earth. We should be doing something. Sometimes, when these debates about public health spending or humanitarian assistance and stuff, they take on this very they get framed in geopolitical terms by those, either the advocates of preserving them or the advocates of cutting them, right? Oh, we shouldn't be spending money to give, a seed or fertilizer to farmers in Cameroon. We should be buying, munitions for Taiwan. Or no, actually, we need to be investing in NGOs in Guinea-Bissau because that'll help us, fight the soft power of the Chinese. There's, a degree of truth to all this. There are geopolitical dimensions, absolutely. But I think that sometimes the kind of those dynamics or those dimensions of humanitarian assistance sometimes get talked up a bit more in DC, because it's a way for advocates of one position or another to kind of connect this question of humanitarian funding or whatever to the broader, geopolitical climate and, the political debates of the day.
I don't want to take all your time, but I have one final question here. We hit on China a bit. How do you anticipate China's influence moving forward in Africa over the next few years? Obviously, it's been a topic of conversation for a long time around the world, but Africa obviously as well. Do you think anything's going to shift with the new administration in the U.S. And given the Chinese government's relationship with Trump, how do you anticipate this unfolding?
Yeah, the Chinese already have quite a lot of influence in Africa, right? In terms of, I mean, in various ways, right? The I think what gets the most attention, understandably so, is kind of the economic, uh, the investment, the foreign direct investments, and the loans and stuff that they've given to African states, especially over the past 20 years. And then, as part of that, even you see a pretty large kind of flow of Chinese individuals, Chinese workers, businessmen, and stuff coming to the region and setting up and setting businesses or working directly for Chinese parastatals. And then there's also the political dimension. I wrote a report about this a few years ago for Hudson Institute that the Chinese are no longer they're not exporting Maoism or anything, right? They don't have kind of this strong revolutionary ideology to try to rally up the global masses. But that doesn't mean that there's not a so-called ideological dimension to their foreign policy. They do clearly believe that the Chinese system, the CCP system, is superior, and if not even the world historic force that can lift up the developing world out of poverty and bring stability and stuff. So they do, especially under Xi, they've become more pronounced in how they talk about the Chinese system and praising their own system and kind of encouraging other countries and even in some instances training politicians from other countries like this is how a good kind of Leninist party works in the 21st century. So you have that ideological dimension that's strong, and I think that element will probably get stronger under a Trump administration. In part just because I think it would be no surprise to say that there's going to be some serious an escalation of whether it's the tariff wars or rhetoric and military spending, all that stuff. So the Chinese will in turn want to kind of pronounce or promote their narrative in Africa. And then, on the question of, say, military influence or whatever, the Chinese, they sell a lot of weapons in Africa, so do a lot of other countries. They've not, there's no Chinese Wagner group, for example, so they're not really inserting themselves and even kind of stirring the pot of these internal conflicts or civil wars in a way that the Russians do. That's one, I think, very important thing to keep in mind when looking at Chinese and Russian influence in Africa in this kind of period of so-called power competition. The Chinese, in some ways, they prefer stability because they're there for the economic benefits and expound on, like I said, promote their governance models to some extent. So that's kind of all that being said, right? Those are maybe three elements of Chinese influence, maybe in descending order. I don't see any of those fundamentally changing in the next few years. The Chinese have, as much as the economic and the political dimensions go hand in hand, and of course China is buying a lot of political influence when it invests in these countries. There is also still an economic logic to it, right? And so what we've seen, not just in Africa but across much of the world, whether it's Latin America, Central Asian stuff, is that compared to maybe the real boom years, say 5-10 years ago, China has they wasted some on some of these projects, and I think they've learned that. And they've learned that some of these African borrowers are not reliable borrowers. And so there's now some tension. Individually, there's kind of bilateral tension or questions about, debt forgiveness, loan forgiveness, all of that stuff. And I know that the Chinese are not happy with some of their projects and some of their investments that they made in Africa. So they, it was a couple of years ago, the Chinese FDI and the loans as well, that those actually dropped, the volume dropped quite a bit. And partially that was the COVID tightening and then maybe just the general, economic challenges that China was having with COVID, with Evergrande, all that stuff. At the last Forum of China Africa conference, which is the big kind of FOCAC, the big gathering that the Chinese hold for African leaders in China. At the last one, they kind of, rather than announcing these big, expensive mega projects, they announced a good bit of funding, but a lot of it was kind of in, relatively smaller scale projects, create a firm here, create a factory here for producing solar panels, stuff like that. A lot of it was focused on green energy, which I think is the one area where they're very much trying to become kind of a local leader, whether it's with electric cars or solar panels or anything like that. So their kind of overall investment strategy and economic footprint is changing a little bit. And also, this is in the context of growing investment from other partners or from other countries in Africa, right? So the Gulf states, only recently have kind of Western academics and commentators started really appreciating, I think, the degree of influence that the Gulf states have accrued very rapidly in parts of Africa. The Emiratis now are investing billions of dollars across the continent, while also, kind of inserting themselves in some ways into these local civil wars, whether it's in Sudan, elsewhere. So, the Chinese are not the only lenders to Africa. They're not the only it's not China versus the West. It's a lot more, you have different actors, different stakeholders, different investors. So I think also the Chinese, their own perspective is also, it's not a zero sum game necessarily in terms of we have to be the one to kind of control everything. Like you don't really see them necessarily competing per se with, say, the Emiratis over, port access in Somaliland or something. But to the extent that the U.S.-China relationship is going to be pretty fraught coming years, there's going to be that continued tension and stuff. I mean, we see what China's saying about Taiwan and everything. I think that will mean that they will also, they will, they'll also see, especially when it comes to kind of American influence, American investment, they will also start to see things a bit more. I think they already are seeing it through kind of a Cold War lens, but I think that will continue and possibly escalate. And whereas the Chinese have traditionally tried to be kind of subtle and vague, at least in the past 20 years or so, when criticizing, say, the U.S. or the West to African audiences, because they don't want to come across as too Cold War, pick us or them. They've kind of been a bit careful about how they couch it and try to say, we're providing you an alternative. But that rhetoric has started to change and I think become a bit more aggressive in recent years. And I think that will continue in the coming years as we have this growing kind of tension, maybe that they'll become a bit, a bit more, a bit more, focused on kind of framing Africa in terms of this broader global struggle or contest.
Well, thanks so much. I mean, this has been just incredibly helpful to us. We've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure that our listeners have too. And we're going to continue following your work and, of course, just cheering you on as you move through that PhD. Thank you, James. We really appreciate it.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and to share with your friends.